Welcome back to the Barrel Proof Baseball Podcast. Today we are joined by Alistair Brogan and Ryan Negley from Boulder Spirits out of Boulder, Colorado. Um, so this is another distillery that I've had the opportunity to talk to coming out of Colorado. I'm becoming more and more, I guess, intrigued by this scene of Colorado distilleries. There's a lot of really good whiskey coming out of Colorado right now. I've had Breckenridge and Bear Creek. Both have come on. Boulder, they've been awesome. And it's another whiskey coming out of Colorado that I'm just really, really excited about. I'm really hoping to try their peated whiskey, but the one that I've got was their straight bourbon whiskey. I had an opportunity to talk with Alistair and Ryan Negley about their whiskey and what they're making, and just the kind of the process that they're going through, and the influence that Alistair had in his roots coming from Scotland, and they're making really good whiskey. So I'm hoping to be able to find some bottles out here in Arizona because I'm really digging this stuff. But I think this was a good episode. We talked for a while. It's like an hour and a half. But we had such a good conversation. These guys are so knowledgeable about just whiskey in general. Plus, they're passionate about making good whiskey. It's like all these people I talk to that are so into making good whiskey. And obviously Boulder Spirits is no exception to that trend that's coming about out of Colorado, especially. So if you're in Colorado or an area that you can get Boulder Spirits, I would definitely suggest trying to get your hands on a bottle. It's very reasonably priced. It's very good. They offer a wide variety of whiskeys. So I think you should check them out. I really like them. Check them out on social media. They're very active on social media. They do a really nice job. And I would just, suggest trying out some Boulder Spirits. So I'll leave some links below in the description so you can check them out. Get to them a little bit easier. Check out some of our sponsors, friends, some links to help out the channel, Walk Offs and Whiskey, Manscaped, Amazon store, all the fun things, Bottomless Coffee. So check those out. Check out Boulder Spirits and enjoy this episode with Ryan and Alistair. All right. Here with Alistair Brogan and Ryan Negley from Boulder Spirits. Guys, thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. We're happy to be here.
So if you guys wouldn't mind, maybe
Absolutely.
tell me a little bit about yourselves, how you got into whiskey, how do you guys find yourselves here where you are right now?
Okay. So, well, step back. I'm obviously not from the US. I'm from a little country called Scotland. And I moved over here 8 years ago now with my American wife, who was latterly in Florida. We met in Florida, went back to Scotland, and then we came back to the US 8 years ago. And we made the decision that what I wanted to do was try and make as good an American single malt whiskey as I could. And with that, I brought traditional Scottish copper pot still from the famed Forsyth of Rothes. And it's a still that's specifically designed for malted barley and really over the world, any single malt whiskies that are made 100% malted barley. So I joined a distillery here, brought my still in, started producing whiskey about 6 years ago. And now our whiskies are both, mature, fantastic. We do a line of 7 whiskies. And really my ambition was American single malt whiskey. We also do within that range of 7 whiskies, we do 3 of those are bourbons. So we do a very different type of bourbon, which we can go into a little bit later. But that's my background. Before that, I was in the military. After that, I was in a business for 15 years before I came over here to the US when I was in my early 40s.
I was before Ryan goes, I was trying to look up a little bit of information. Now, Alistair, are there any TV shows by chance that you've ever been on that you would care to talk about?
Oh, gee, thanks, Ryan.
It wasn't.
Yeah,
I had to look it up.
I can't even remember it.
Yeah, I got to ask. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, well, I think I was about 32 years old. Yeah, I must have been about 32, 33 at the time. And I did the British Survivor, which I think is still going on American TV. But we had, it was actually originally a British format. And I did the second season. And then they cancelled it after the second season because we were, as a group, we were far too boring. We didn't, no controversy, nothing. We went out to Panama, kept our mouth shut, didn't want to make fools of ourselves, and it was a great experience and great fun.
That's great. Ryan, how about yourself? Tell me a little bit about you.
Quick, you can hear me right now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I come in it from the on-premise trade, so I came as a bartender. I was, the cocktail world was quickly shaping, itself into where it is now, 15, 20 years ago. And coincidentally at the same time, so were craft spirits. And so I come in it from the bartender's perspective, but also from the craft spirits world. So I've had a chance to work with 3 craft distilleries over the course of the last 10 years. So I've kind of really found that niche, but coming, like I said, just coming from the bartending world, I was a founding member of the Denver Whiskey Club, and we were in it from we're 11 years old now, but it was always about education. Never really had any inklings of single barrel purchases and doing any of that kind of stuff. It was just about learning about brands and learning about distilleries and all that kind of stuff.
Now, so how did Boulder Spirits come about? How do you Alistair, you mentioned you moved here and you got it going. Like, how do you decide to make that jump into starting your own brand?
Well, I think it was meant to be started as a hobby, to be honest, Tony. It was really going to be a hobby. And when I came across, I bought a still, which was a pretty big still. And once we joined, really a gin company we joined originally, we brought the still in and started making our whiskeys. It just got bigger and bigger, and found myself having to do work full time here. And we wanted to produce whiskey, so we produced quite a lot of whiskey here, and we got a lot of whiskey in barrels. But for me, it was always going to be a hobby, and I had some great friends who were master distillers back in Scotland, and they really, really assisted me in really sort of fine tuning what I was trying to do. Now, we're not making Scotch. We're not making even a single malt whiskey. We're making a single malt whiskey that is uniquely American, but it's also uniquely Boulder because of a lot of the attributes Boulder has, or Colorado has, as in the climate, as in the spectacular water that we have here. So Boulder is about, our distillery is really about place and process. So we've got the processes of our single malt whiskey, and the place is very, very important to us because of that water, because of that climate.
And you guys are making your own whiskey, correct?
Yeah, we make it from grain to glass, as they say. Okay. So there isn't, as you know, there's not many ingredients in whiskey. Really, there is only water, yeast, malted barley. And I would even put the barrel, because it goes into new oak barrels in the US, as opposed to ex-bourbon barrels in the rest of the world. There's only really 4 ingredients to single malt whiskey. And what's spectacular is every single malt whiskey is distinctly different, even although that's all that's in the ingredients.
And why Boulder? I'm just curious. Out of the, I love Boulder. I think it's a beautiful place, but I'm just curious what led you to Boulder specifically. And I've heard a lot about the water in Colorado, how it's unique in terms of comparing to other places throughout the country. But why specifically Boulder?
I think it was more my wife and I looked at where we didn't want to live in America. So we didn't want to live in the crowded coasts or with the tornadoes or the hurricanes, or we didn't want to be in a climate that was too cold or too hot and sweaty. So we decided in Boulder because of the skiing, because of the mountains, and we visited here just on 9 years ago, and we just fell in love with the place. It was just a fantastic location for a distillery, but also a fantastic location to bring up a family. So I've got two boys, one at 10 and one at 12. So they've been here now for that 8-9 years, and it really is a great place to bring a family up. But we got here in 2012, so now it's a different Boulder than even those 9 years ago.
Sure. Now, Ryan, can you talk a little bit about your role right now with Boulder Spirits?
Yeah, so we're a very small team. Currently, our company basically consists of 6 folks. Alistair's one of them. He is an actual owner operator, so he's got a full day, pretty much 7 days a week. As a small business owner. We've got our production manager, and then our head distiller, our only distiller. And then we've got, our bookkeeper, accountant, kind of catch all for all office and everything. And then we've got myself, and we just hired another sales rep for in-state here in Colorado. So we're really a baby company. So my job with the company is kind of everything forward facing. Kind of it's almost old school in the term sales and marketing, back when it was, one thing, and before they were so divided. But all of the sales and all of the marketing, and it's, again, we as a company, we all wear all of the hats, that old adage. But really anything forward facing, and anybody that wants to hear us talk about whiskey, chances are I'm the guy that's talking about our whiskey.
That's there's probably worse ways you can spend your day than talking about whiskey. I mean,
yeah, no, I wake up and I'm not religious, but I'm very grateful,
Sure.
Especially over this last year. Remember, I come from behind the bar, and
yeah,
that entire chunk of my life, just all of my friends that are still in it, they I'm only a few years out from being just completely decimated from an entire industry. So
sure.
Even though we're on a fringe edge of that industry, it's still very impactful on us. And on a personal note, it was tough to see all that happen, but very grateful to be where I'm at now. And especially, again, part of my job title is talking about whiskey, so I'm happy.
Yeah, I can imagine. Now, how did you get into whiskey? What was your introduction into it, or how did you become more interested in it at a deeper level?
Yeah, I was, coming out of bartending, when bartending was just more about the neighborhood bar, and it was beers and shots and simple whiskey sodas, whiskey gingers, all that kind of stuff, and and it was really back in the 90s. There weren't that many brands, especially that many brands putting marketing behind their stuff. And for me, and I tell everybody this too, I tell everybody this in the whiskey aisle. It's funny. When Four Roses, when Kirin acquired Four Roses, and a few years later, under the guidance of Jimmy Rutledge, they put out an extended line, and kind of had a rebrand on Four Roses, and launched the small batch and the single barrel series. That was kind of it for me. That really kind of turned my head on what bourbon was. And it wasn't just, the 4 or 5 labels that we're all used to, but, there was really a bigger world to it. And it wasn't just about price, anymore. Like, we were just so used to bourbons. It was all $16, this is kind of how much it all was. And then, of course, I'd started to learn a little bit more about the Beam extended line of, spirits with Bookers and Bakers and all that kind of stuff. And back then, Blanton's and all that kind of stuff was sitting dusty on shelves. So I was lucky to be, one of the first bartenders in Denver, kind of actively seeking out kind of these kind of whiskeys for the back bar. So that's kind of my realm into the whiskey nerdum.
And Alistair, how about yourself? Were you a bourbon fan? Did you stick strictly with Scotch, or what was your background with whiskey?
Well, I think in Scotland and the UK, as a whole, we don't drink much bourbon. We don't drink much American whiskeys, to be honest. Maybe some Jack Daniels, but that's about it. So, with 130 active distilleries in Scotland, they export 1.5 billion bottles of Scotch around the world. We've got it in plentiful supply. So, as I grew up in Scotland and then latterly England, there was always whiskey on tap everywhere you went.
Mm-hmm.
And the Scots are big single malt whiskey drinkers, and Europeans are big single malt whiskey drinkers. So I grew up with the cheap blends, the Famous Grouse, some of the other cheaper ones, and then moving into, as most whiskey people do, as well as they start earning money, into the Glenfarclas, the Glenmorangie, the Isleys, and really a lot of Scots spread their taste around a lot of whiskies. Yeah, that's how really I got into it. Now it's a whole new realm, looking at bourbons and ryes or wheats. Very, very different to me. So I've been here 8 years, and I'm getting into them more and more. Our bourbon is very, very different, as we'll talk about a little later.
Mm-hmm.
Our bourbon is very different. It's a little bit of a nod to Scotland in the glass, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah, I was curious about that peated. You guys have a peated one. I had to imagine there was a little bit of Scottish influence involved in that one.
Oh, absolutely. We could not do a peated single malt whiskey, and it's proved very popular. Again, we do things slightly different. It's a very low ppm count. It's very approachable. We do a couple of things different in our distillation with our cuts that are not done in Scotland, which really does make a bit of a difference. And I think we've had a lot of people who absolutely hate peat have come into our distillery and loved it, and vice versa. We've had these peat heads coming in, and they've enjoyed the subtlety of that whiskey. Because in the US, it really is, with what's on the market, it's really sort of all or nothing. Here, it's either no peat or a hell of a lot of peat, and I think that puts a lot of people off the flavors of peat. It's overpowering to somebody that tastes it for the first time.
Sure. I personally, I hadn't got into Scotch. I just never, not that I disliked it, I just never got into it. So I recently got an Ardbeg, a fairly young Ardbeg that was pretty peaty, and I really enjoyed that. And I got a peated Irish whiskey from Teeling, and I really like it. I'm interested in that peat now. I'm kind of want to dive into that a little bit more. And I'm afraid of the rabbit hole I could definitely go down with those some of those Islay Scotches.
No, big time. And
Yeah,
to kind of Al's point about how we touch on, in the United States market, it's peat or no peat kind of a deal, and we're not very educated as a mass consumer on the intricacies of single malt whiskey, and so this rabbit hole is deep, because when you start learning that Highlands whiskeys have, peated flavors about them, and you'll go to Lowland whiskeys and there's certain distilleries that are like, oh no, we're going to be putting a little bit of peat into this build of our whiskey because it provides such an absolute. I mean, it's everything about Scotland are those coasts for the outside consumer really is, and it's that grand romanticism about it. But there's such we'd love to be able to introduce our peat at a way that's more reflective of the nuances that peat can create, versus just saying this is peated, this is smoke, and that's all that we care about, because it's not all we care about. Sure.
Yeah, I think it's a nice addition to a good whiskey, and doesn't have to be the overwhelming flavor profile that leads that whole drink off. But I think it's a nice, like that Ardbeg I got, it's really nice. And so I have to imagine like a American whiskey with some peat, it's got to be fairly interesting.
Yeah, it's imagine that, but remember, American whiskeys, we just have so much of a richer mouthfeel and body, and so apply that, with this idea of peat, and we'll get you a sample out there soon. We'll have little July podcast about it.
Okay, I'm into that idea. So how did you? Okay, so you're in Boulder now, Alistair. You're ready to go. You've got this idea. I mean, I'm imagine it starts with permitting and all the red tape that you've got to go through to get licensing to start a distillery and all that. And once you've gone through that process, how do you start? You've decided you're going to do this. You're going through the process. Like, now what?
Well, I really just wanted to make single malt whiskey. That's all I really wanted to make. But I sort of reality struck, and I had a great distiller here, Ted, who was a distiller for the gins, and we made the decision that we were then going to add our bourbons at the same time, and it was a great decision to make. But we wanted to do something different with the bourbon, so we have a high malted barley content in our bourbons. So it really is a bit of a lean to that flavors that you have in a single malt, which is that maltiness, that creaminess that you get in a single malt. So yeah, I mean, the permitting was not that hard because I came into an established business, so we were able to start making a single malt very quickly. So we waited, we sold our gin, we sold our vodka, we sold our liqueurs, and then after 2 years, when it became a straight whiskey, new oak barrels, it's number 3 char we used, we brought it out and it wasn't ready. And, straight whiskey, 2 years, even at the climate we have in Colorado, it really powers that filtration through the char. Because of the massive swings in temperature in Colorado, there's massive swings in pressure. So it breathes in and out that char and filtrates very quickly. Even at that, we found after 2 years, it wasn't there yet. So we left it. We left it just short of 3 years before we felt that it was ready to come out. That's a long time. Just to give a quick example, for best calculations, we are losing about, after the initial fill of the barrel, of about 10 to 15 litres gets sucked into the wood. We are losing about 4 to 5%, 4% to evaporation each year. That's a lot of evaporation, and to the angel share. And you go to Scotland where it's cold, and cold. You have none of these swings, and they're losing probably around about a third of that. So there really is. It just shows there's a lot of action and reaction happening in that filtration in that wood because of where we're located. So different if we were in the Pacific Northwest. Different if we were where you are, different if you were in Kentucky. And this is why we're going to get really regionalized whiskies throughout the US. And I think it's going to become, more obvious within single malt whiskey because the nuances of aging and depth and complexity of whiskey allows those different locations to have a real impact on the whiskies. I've had single malts from the Northwest, Northeast, Kentucky, and each and every one of us is significantly different.
Does the lack of humidity in your area, does that play a role in the aging process?
Yes. I mean, lack of humidity, hot summers, swings in temperature has huge impacts on that. As does where you keep your lesser influence of where you keep your barrels in the rack house. But yeah, it does make a big difference. And it's how big a difference? Well, when I compare it to, as I said, to the Pacific Northwest, whiskies, huge difference. When I compare it to Kentucky single malt, more Texan single malt whiskies, huge difference. It's also very important that the water makes a huge difference. We use El Dorado water, which is a local well about 6 miles south of here. And award-winning water comes from a well. The water table is still, the snow melt off the Rocky Mountains. So that makes a big difference as well.
Can you define, because I know I've been asked this and I hate to say it, but I don't have a good explanation specifically. what is or how would you define specifically a single malt whiskey?
Well, I mean, that's a big question, because there's single malt whiskey, which it would traditionally, we all attribute Scotland to. So Scotch single malt whiskey, which has its own rules, but in our case, we're American single malt whiskey. And so within the United States, it's really nothing more than a gentleman's handshake agreement as to what that means. Within the rules that we all submit our recipes of our whiskeys to, the TTB, the Tax and Trade Bureau. We have a set of guidelines, standards of identity that define what bourbon is, define what rye whiskey is, define what malt whiskey is. But what we don't have is a definitive standard of identity of what American single malt whiskey is. Now, we actually do have a lobby, and we've got our set of rules that we'd like to see adhered to, literally waiting for somebody in the Treasury Department to sign off on. But in the meantime, and we do adhere to all of those rules, it's going to be 100% malted barley, of course, because it's malt whiskey, and single malt doesn't refer to the single, and most single malt refers to a single distillery. So that's also important. So if you have single malt in your whiskey label in the United States, that's not a sourced product. The idea is that you're not allowed to put single malt. Well, just like putting bonded, right? You could put bonded on your bourbon if you don't, if you do source it. So single malt within and of itself would mean both of those things, the barley as well as the distillation by the own distillery. Barrels, that's kind of a contentious topic within the community of American single malt producers. For us, we want to follow the rules of straight whiskey, so it's really American whiskey, and that means freshly charred virgin American oak barrels. And for us, it's a 53-gallon level. I guess you can see them behind now, but 53-gallon level 3 char on our barrels from Kelvin Cooperage. So we're adhering certainly more to the American aging aspect, because for us, that's what we're doing, is we're making an American whiskey. It is a single malt whiskey made by a fellow from Scotland, but this is an American whiskey.
I really, and again, I know this is probably not for, most people that are going to find it to be a big thing. I love the fact that you've got on this, that it's a number 3 char. Because I think that people, I really do. Like, I think that people ask that, like they want, because I know that plays a role in what flavors you're getting. And I think that's a great added thing to put on your bottling.
We had, sorry.
It's all right. I'm shocked mine's sleeping right now, so we're good.
Yeah, we had, and when it was time for label design for this update on our packaging, we wanted to be as absolutely detailed and forthright with our messaging as possible. Transparency is a huge part of telling our brand and our brand story. And for us, the label, has to represent just that, which tell everything about it. It says the recipe, on the label. It's got our exact coordinates of where it's aged. It says 53-gallon barrels on it. It's a level 3 char. So if you're an in the know whiskey consumer, you can already have an idea of what's going on in this bottle. And it's not just the story on the back label, but we're telling you all the components of the whiskey itself.
Yeah. I think that makes it so.
We want it to be.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
We will just on we really want it to be incredibly transparent in what we do and how we do it. So it's about, the label is about the process. It's about the location, because the location is as important as the process. So, that's the actual copper pot still, 100% malted barley. That's the flat irons out in Boulder. We wanted to do that because for me, I find it quite difficult looking at the whiskey shelves in the US. You can have 2 rye whiskeys, and one rye whiskey could be 51% rye and 49% corn. Another rye whiskey could be 99% rye and 1% wheat. So how is the consumers really going to understand what flavors are going to get out of those 2 rye whiskeys? They'll be significantly different. And I think a lot of consumers think, well, I don't like rye whiskey. Well, you drank a rye that's got a mash bill completely different from anybody else. So understanding what the mash, and here's the thing, you can't copy. It's almost impossible to copy. The Scots have tried it, trying to copy other people's whiskey, even though they're all getting their barley and their water source, all the same places. But it's about the location. It's about a big degree is it's about the shape of the still. And our still was specifically designed to give a little heavier whiskey, a lot of the heavier particles and flavors were able to get over the linarm of our still. So we were able to put that in a new oak barrel. Because
I'm going to interrupt you real quick, Al. Tony, if you grab your bottle, you can actually see on the label.
Yeah, I saw
that is our still.
Up here.
Like that really is our still.
Yeah.
And that linarm, as we're talking about, the arm that shoots off the top of the still, a lighter whiskey would be made with a linarm that comes up. Our linarm goes down. And so what we're trying to do is capture a heavier, richer whiskey because, as Al was alluding to, we are aging in freshly charred oak. So we've got a lot of filtration at our backs to help filter out those heavier congeners. Sorry.
That angle of the arm is really what that plays a significant role in it, right?
Huge, because if you look at the 130 distilleries in Scotland, a lot of them are using, they're across the road from each other. Some of them using the same water, owned by the same distillery company, same yeast. Everything is the same. They might even be getting their barrels from the same supplier at Kentucky, but the biggest difference is the shape of that still. That still can be small, fat, double bubble, as Ryan said, linarm, pointing up, pointing down, all shapes and sizes, and it makes a colossal difference. And this is the flexibility we had from day one, is designing our own still for malted barley going into a new oak barrel. And we spent a lot of time and effort really sort of understanding. And when I did it, there hadn't been many stills exported out into the US from a Scottish copperworks.
In theory, you could have one mash bill, change your char level and the angle of the arm on the still, and come out with multiple different whiskeys.
Yeah, and here's an interesting thought. To be honest, you could literally do exactly that and have a linarm that can actually move in production. Wow. And then you could have different whiskeys, literally different whiskeys coming off. And it would be a great experiment to have. But most of the traditional Scottish distilleries, they have had the same still for 250 years. They've had the same still. So they've ended up making the same still when they get it renewed. These stills will last 100 years. When they get them renewed, Macallan's, for example, just as I ordered my still, I think it was about 26 stills. And the requirement from the manufacturer was really, we want them identical in every way. You can't change the old stories of, if there's a dent in it, put a dent in it as well, because it makes that much of a difference in that shape of the still. So Macallan ordered the stills that ensured that they're identical to the ones that they had 50, 60 years ago.
Wow.
And we're one of very few pot distilled bourbons in the United States. There's only a handful of, obviously the big one being Woodford and their setups that they've got going on. And Willett, of course, has their pot still. And the craft community has a lot of pot column combos, but not truly pot distilled. And so we're making a truly pot distilled bourbon. And part of that, of course, is our mash bill being such a high malted barley content. But really what we're able to do is get a different style of a cook on this bourbon recipe than we're going to see from the 98% other column distilled bourbons that we're going to see out there. So we really truly do have a unique touch kind of from the get-go. Of course, our mash bill is fun and unique, but anybody can use that mash bill, right? Our yeast is more designed towards the malted barley. So that's another kind of check on what's going to make ours taste quite a bit different. We're pot distilled on a still that's designed for malted barley. So the linarm's pointing down. So there's 4 and 5. They go on and on, but really the aging aspect, and you could take, we could cook anybody's exact recipe on their exact setup, age it in Colorado, it's going to taste different.
And you mentioned like your The mash bill is the Colorado the one that was 51% corn.
Yeah, so we have one mash bill of bourbon.
Oh, it's just staying the same for everything.
Yeah, so it's one mash bill of bourbon, one, obviously 100% malted barley for the single malt, and then our peated malt that's as well. So not necessarily 3 recipes, but 3 styles. But one bourbon recipe, 51 corn, 44% malted barley, 5% rye.
So it's just, you went legal limit of bourbon and went right above it and said, hey, let's malt this thing.
I mean, the rules are left open there for creativity, and so Alistair got real creative.
Yeah, why not? I think that's really cool. It's so different than because I feel like the space is very, we'll say, crowded. There's a lot of bourbons out there, so it's like, what's different? What is happening? What's different?
Right.
Why am I going to buy a bottle of Boulder Spirits versus somebody else? Even in Colorado, with the distillery scene in Colorado seems to be blowing up. So why am I going to go Boulder Spirits? Well, it's different. It's a different whiskey. Yeah, I think it's really cool. Yeah. I think there's
and all the whiskeys in Colorado are significant.
There's
there's even 4 or 5 single malt whiskeys in Colorado.
Now, are you getting grains? Everything that you're getting, are they fairly local to you guys?
No, especially not for our single malt. We do import our grain from the UK for the barley. It's 100% from the UK. We do it for a couple of reasons. One, the Scotch industry has been around for a very, very, very long time. Mm-hmm. That means their base product of malted barley has been around for a very, very long time. So the science behind the malted barley coming out of the UK is just producing more spirit per pound. And it's just a really beautiful whiskey spirit. Mm-hmm. Whereas most of the malted barley available in the United States is really for beer production. Even though it's the same malting style and same malting houses that are making the beer and the spirits, which isn't all that uncommon, but it's more of a 95% beer to 5% spirits. Mm-hmm. And so it's not so specialized in malting for the distilling industry. And so we're just getting less yield, great flavor. But when we had a choice to make a really great whiskey that can only cost $50 or $60 or $70 on the shelf versus making a great single malt whiskey that would end up being $70, $80, $90, $100 on the shelf, we had to go with tried and true. And the fact of the matter is, we share our grain source with some of the greatest malt whiskey in the world. So, sure. It's no fact that we hide behind, but we do have probably 40, maybe 50 barrels of local grain whiskey aging on our premise project with a local malt and farm that's literally just minutes up the road. That's a really fun project. But our single malt whiskey specifically is made with the imported malt barley. Not saying that there's not, again, a future for that window to be open.
It was difficult. It was difficult to source anything that wasn't made for beer, and it was the same as the yeast. A lot of the yeasts here, we were the first importers into the US of AB Mori yeast. So it's a distiller's yeast. So we're using distillers malted barley, a distiller's yeast. Therefore, we get a distiller's mash. We've had a few people in here that great minds regarding whiskey, and there's a distinct flavor difference between a beer mash and a distiller's mash. And as one expert said to us the other day, they said, a beer mash is good, but it's distinctly Colorado beer mash because of the grains from Colorado. So if you went up to Montana, Wyoming, or any of these states, they're going to have a different flavor within their malted barley, because nobody really uses malted barley in the whiskey. And that's why, we wanted to do the bourbon with a high malted barley. So when we looked around, we couldn't find any. And there is a little bit of American barley tends to be heavily genetically modified, whereas European barley, and that's a little added advantage.
Yeah, I have to imagine trying to find a American-made, non-GMO, distillers specific grain is going to be a little bit challenging.
I mean, yeah, and I'm sure someday we'll find it, and 4 or 5 years later, it'll be $100 bottle of whiskey on the shelf.
Yeah, you're paid
I
for
hope
it.
we do. I really do want to, get to the point where we can get that experimental with it. I mean, we're trying to take as much data as we possibly can anytime we cook, and especially when we use new sources of malt or corn or rye or whatever the case may be. But for now, we're going to focus on these core line of products. You've got our bourbon, of course. So that one recipe right now yields 3 labels of bourbon on the Colorado market and New Mexico market and a few other markets. And then that basically one recipe of malt that we have at the distillery, I think 6 labels of our single malt available, but in Colorado, 4 or 5 are distributed.
So I'm curious about, so for example, you mentioned some of your other bottles. You got a couple finishes, right? You've got a port and a sherry, and then you've got, is that right?
Yeah, we've got a sherry cask finished bourbon that was launched at the end of 2020. We've got a sherry, Oloroso sherry finished single malt that's a distillery only release. We've got a ruby port finished single malt that's out in the market. And then, of course, we've got in barrel, right? We actually just got some new Oloroso barrels, I think, Al. Is that what it is?
Yep, just about to come in.
Yeah, so we've got both bourbon and malt going into some stuff, and as we're growing, one of my goals is to take some of these older fruit barrels that we've already used. Sorry, I call them fruit barrels, fruitier barrels, and get some peated malt in there. That's kind of I really want to taste that.
A peated malt with one of those fruitier type barrels. I'll meet you in Boulder for that one, by the way. That sounds really interesting. Yeah, I mean, it looks like, you guys are offering a lot of different types of bottles. I mean, what's your yield like, coming out in terms of, if you're doing a single malt, how much of that is going directly to your straight bourbon versus how much of that is being put into something else that's going to be finished in a secondary barrel?
Well, we're quite lucky because we've the sweet spot for us is once we take our, whether it be single malt whiskey or bourbon, already matured into a finishing barrel, we're about 6 to 8 months. So that's easier to manage as far as sales and projections. But we've got a lot in our a lot of bourbon and a lot of single malt whiskey stored. So that's the longest time that we need for the maturation. So as we deplete, we then buy more finishing barrels. The only one that it's difficult to project is the peated, because that takes as long as anything else. So we're balancing up to see how much peat people are interested in, and then we'll have to lay down a few more barrels. Because the older the barrels get with peated single malt whiskey, the ppm starts to drop off. So in that new oak especially. So it gets a bit lighter and lighter as the years progress. And our oldest our oldest peat is about 5 years now.
How, in terms of maybe not necessarily just the ppm, but where do you put the level of peat, like in comparison to, like an Islay Scotch? Obviously I'm not expecting it to be all the way up there, but.
No, I mean, like a Laphroaig would be 40 to 50 phenols per million. Ours is probably down at a guess, because it really is a bit of a guess, 10 to 15. So we're way down. And most, Laphroaig is, 1 million cases a year in the US.
Sure.
And people love Laphroaig, but that is a pretty peaty proposition. So if you've tasted that in your 20s, it could put you off peat for the rest of your life, and you'll never taste it again. But whereas ours is down at a 10 or 15, so it's more approachable. It's a little bit more subtle. It's an expression. So you're still getting something. You're getting more than peat. With a Laphroaig, it seems to be peat, and a lot of people love that. I.e., 1 million cases in the US.
They're doing okay.
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
talk.
they don't see us as competition.
Yeah. So I'm curious about, so and again, I don't know much about like the distillation process of, whether it's gin or vodka, rum, anything else other than whiskey, but talk about like that comparison of the art and science of making whiskey in relation to, making a clear spirit. I mean, what is that like? Is it as interesting and as fun to make some of those vodkas or other clear spirits as it is to get into the whiskeys?
Sorry, I missed that last bit again. Could you ask
Just
that question again?
comparing like the process of making whiskey and bourbon versus like a clear spirit, like a gin or a vodka. I mean, I'm curious about how that process differs and your personal enjoyment of making each maybe separately.
Well, we do a gin. We actually do an incredible barrel aged gin called Ginsky, and we take our Boulder gin and put it in a new oak barrel, exactly the same way as we do with our bourbons or our single malts, and let that gin mature over two years. And then we've actually got a bottled and bond barrel aged gin, and it comes out a lot of the flavors you normally expect in a whiskey, but it is gin. The actual process of making gin is quite quick and easy. It's literally on demand because there's no real aging process. So we keep a stock, but as stocks deplete, we can make a lot of gin very, very quickly. And it's an easy process. Whereas the whiskey process, you have to be a little bit more detailed regarding cuts, where you do your cuts, being consistent with your cuts. The only thing that really changes in our distillery is temperatures and pressures. That can have an impact on how hot the spirit runs off the still. So we still have to keep a real eye on how we're distilling and ensuring that the new make spirit tastes good. You don't have to have that same detail when you're doing gins or you're doing a vodka. So if you get that part of it right, really, you're putting it in the barrel. And yes, there's barrel management, there's quality of barrel, but really you're leaving it up to the gods to see what comes out at the end. And we left it up to the gods when we first put it in the barrel and just prayed that it would get better and better, because you can really only determine it coming into the second year. Towards the end of the second year, you're then beginning to say, hey, this is coming along great. So we've got a process now that we are not changing because we've got it. I think we've got it nailed. And yeah, if we do other products, we'll change our process. But I think we've got, for what we are doing, it's now a repeat process with just monitoring.
It's yeah, not knowing much about gin. I think the process of making whiskey is fascinating. And so it always makes me curious because you hear people talk about making whiskey and they're so into it, which rightfully so. I think it's really cool. But I just wonder if that process is similar. The enjoyment is necessarily similar in making a vodka or a gin, where, like you said, it can be done significantly more rapidly.
Yeah, and to be fair and transparent, we on our vodka, we don't have a column still. So it's impossible for us to make vodka. So our base spirit is a non-GMO 93% corn spirit. That is the base of our vodka and gin. So because we don't have that step, we're not so worried about trying to make what kind of grain or what kind of specific mash bill of the base spirit. And kudos to all of those distillers out there doing it that way. Sure. But we didn't have to think about that. So all of our R&D went into the 11 botanics and the balance of how that was going to be and how it was going to taste on the final distillation on a pot still. And so those were the big factors. And as Al said, we've been making gin a long time. I mean, it's 12, 13 years now. It's some of the highest awarded gin from the state of Colorado, and it's been one recipe and the same recipe for a very long time. So luckily, yeah, we do have that process down. The fun part of it is now going out to the bars and restaurants and sharing that gin with bartenders and saying, man, what can you make with this? You know, and it's kind of paying that forward and watching what gets created from that. You know, that's what I like to see with our gins.
Sure. Talk a little bit more about some of your different bottles that you're offering, or at least the whiskeys. You know, some of those, I know you've got the Colorado. There's bottled and bond. I was interested in, Alistair, when you mentioned like a bottled and bond gin, does a bottled and bond gin go with the same regulations as a bottled and bond bourbon?
Yes, and it was a little bit of a play on it. The TTB changed the rules, I think it was last May, because any barrel-aged gin has been an oddity. The TTB didn't want you to call it barrel-aged because they didn't really know what that was. It had to be barrel-rested, barrel-matured, all those kind of words. So last May, they made the decision that you could then say it's barrel-aged because it's become incredibly popular, aged gin. And aged gin can be in rum barrels, in sherry, all sorts of barrels, normally for about 6 months. So we jumped on it and decided when the TTB changed it. It's a bit of a fun thing. We said a bottled and bond barrel-aged gin. So we were first in the world to do that. And it was a few barrels that we had at 4 years old. So it's like a whiskey. I mean, the biggest difference, it's a botanical whiskey that has been distilled at 193 rather than the regulation of 160. So you've got no flavors of the grains, but you've got all the flavors of the barrel. And that's what's fun about it. So you've got the botanicals, the sencha tea, the star anise, hibiscus, mainly the sort of floral and citrus, and the coriander. But it's just a fun drink. You wouldn't put it in a gin and tonic, but you would put it in a Negroni or a mule or something like that. And bartenders absolutely love it.
Yeah, and then the bottled and bond bourbon, it was kind of a no-brainer. You know, a lot of small distilleries struggle to get to the point where they're able to release 4-year-old, bourbons. They've got to sell it all at 2 and 3 years old, and everyone's trying to figure out how to catch up. And for us, because of how we laid down a lot of whiskey early, we were lucky to be able to do that. So we were able to put out a full line of bottled and bond bourbon. But the fun part about that is because this bourbon is we're very, very proud of this bourbon that bottled right at just shy of 3 years old, or right at 3 years old. And our bottled and bond bourbon, of course, has to be 4 years old. But our first release of our bottled and bond bourbon was actually 5 summers long, so it kind of had a little bit of a extra age time to it, but still a 4-year bottled and bond. And it's spectacular in the amount of spirit development that happens with our bottled and bond series. It's been doing very well for us here in the Colorado market. And then bottled and bond, of course, just being such an iconic American term, in regards to quality. That's absolutely why we wanted to put it on our American single malt label, because American single malt is still just such a tiny baby category that we're trying to grow. And we really wanted to put a real sense of Americana on this single malt label to kind of help pull away that word, not Scotch single malt, but single malt is the bigger word. It's above all the other names, and we're the American single malt bottled and bond.
I didn't really think about it in those terms, because you don't see a lot of, craft distilleries coming out with a bottled and bond because of, I would imagine, that exact same thing. Like it's hard to sit on a whiskey for 4 years.
Yeah.
And not and go, okay, we're still waiting. We're going to wait this out, guys. Can't sell bottled and bond at 3.5 years.
Yeah, and there are whiskeys even in Colorado that are technically bottled and bond, but they haven't labeled it bottled and bond. So it might be 4 years old. We made the decision. It's a little bit of history. Made the decision, and I tell you, it's catching on because some of the biggest names will remain nameless. This large whiskey house own brands here in Colorado are starting to think we should put something that says bottled and bond, because it's people are becoming educated on what that is. It's a mark of quality. As I said earlier, we looked at our whiskey after 2 years, our bourbon, and it wasn't there yet. We could have brought it out as a straight whiskey, but we decided not to, and we left it to that 3-year point before it was really ready. So when consumers go in, yes, they're paying a little bit more, but they know they're going to get that quality or the standard that is given to bottled and bond products.
Now, when you set out, so when you make your spirits, your whiskey's ready to age, you're putting in. You said it's not ready after 2 years. Now you've got your straight bourbon, it's ready to roll, but you decide to keep going. Do you go with the intent of it being a bottled and bond that you proof down to, what is this, 86, 84? Or how does that work? Do you have separate bottles that are, okay, this is our Colorado that's going to be 84. These are the ones that we know we're setting aside to go 4 years to become our bottled and bond. Like, how does that process work?
Well, it works in as much as when we start dumping barrels, that's the oldest whiskey, we don't dump it all. So it is in the barrel 62.5 ABV. So it goes into the barrel anyway very high. So with our standard bourbon, we obviously just cut that down to 42, and then when we yield the 62.5 ABV, we just cut that down to 50. So the decision is, and the trick is that you keep enough older stuff to meet demand, but then you're able to sell enough of the younger products. So we've got the two. But as we move forward, our bottle and bond will be 6-7 years old, and our standard straight whiskey will be almost that bottled and bond age. Might not have the proof, but it'll have the age. So the quality is going to increase. And as Ryan said, there's not many distilleries that have got the luxury of setting aside those barrels and allowing that process to happen. So with our single malt whiskey, we're now on to about 5.5 years, and it's still tasting, it's still maturing, it's still developing. 3 years it's ready, but it's developing even more. Like Scotch whiskies, whether you're having a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old or an 18-year-old, it's still developing. When that development stops, who knows? Because remember, nobody really in the US has got single malt whiskies that are very, very old. And to be honest, there is a danger that once they get to 7, 8, 9 years, that spirit can be overtaken by the barrel. It becomes lots of tannins, it becomes licking leather, it becomes a little bit too much for the consumer. Now, we've taken the biggest step that we've taken towards that is having that heavier spirit put through our still into the barrel. So I think the development will carry on a little further than using maybe a beer mash in it. But we'll wait and see. We're keeping barrels behind every single year to keep that development.
I mean, that makes total sense. I mean, I would have to imagine anywhere here that is, you have barrels being aged, you're going to have a bigger fluctuation in weather than you would in Scotland, per se, where you can put it in for 18 years in Scotland, and you're not going to have the dramatic highs and lows versus most places here, really.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And that's going to make, and this is the fun part of it is, hey, let's wait and see what happens. I mean, it's not going to be, it's such a slow process that we can keep on just tasting, seeing how the development is. And at the moment, we're delighted with the development of the single malts and the bourbons. And the bourbon will develop differently than maybe a 90% corn bourbon because of the amount of malted barley we have. So we've got to be careful. We just got to keep our eye on that development through the years.
I have to imagine that's a fun part of it where you could say, you know what, let's try this. Let's try a number 4 char and just see how this goes. Or let's try, whatever it might be. And like, this might change enough of
profile that it becomes something pretty special, I would imagine.
Yeah, the variables are pretty.
Well, yeah.
I mean, but just even within the innovations with barrels that are happening right now, there's, we could in theory, make a few batches of whiskey and fill up 30 barrels, and each one of them be 100% different of a barrel.
Crazy.
That's how many options there are now for that's how creative whiskey has gotten from the production level. And of course, the consumer is starting to see some of that. But really over the next 10 years, there's going to be some really, really nuanced, crazy stuff coming out on the market.
I have to imagine. Okay. So we got the bottled and bond single malt, bottled and bond bourbon, the ports that you had talked about, right? Some of those finished ones. Any other finishings you guys are messing around with?
Well, we're actually we did a sherry finished single malt whiskey, and that was, we did 1 barrel of it because again we have no idea how it's going to turn out.
Mm-hmm.
So we put our matured single malt whiskey into a sherry barrel because we also do a sherry bourbon that's on the market, and that turned out great. Again, it was a bit of an experiment. It was 3 barrels. We launched that in the Colorado market because it came out well. We only did 1 sherry finished single malt whiskey, and it came out spectacular. And we only had 1 barrel, though, so we couldn't exactly put it into distribution. So we only sell that from the distillery. It's only a distillery only. But we will start gradually building our inventory on that and launch it into the Colorado market first. Like all craft distilleries, it's about, building that reputation, building your name of quality products so that people, when we do come out with something fun and interesting, we've got a group of enthusiasts that will be knocking on our door and selling it. So we are not been on the market that long. We've only really been on the market for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. And already we certainly are making inroads for the higher quality single malts and even the bourbons now, which, is so rewarding. And as you're talking about it, more rewarding than maybe making gin. Making whiskey is what I wanted to do.
I believe it. I think it'd be fun. I think it just seems like the possibilities are endless in terms of how deep you could get into, tweaking something fairly small and creating something completely different. Can you go through, talk a little bit about about this one, about the straight bourbon, maybe some tasting notes, maybe some things that if people are trying it out, something to, pay attention to
absolutely. This bourbon's really fun to talk about because luckily I've got a breadth of knowledge on just the market, and I've been lucky that I've, had a few hundred bourbons in my, day, as opposed to just, being the brand guy that only has had, our bourbon over and over and over again.
Seems fair.
Yeah. Right. And as far, cause I say that because it's fun to compare our whiskeys to others, or not necessarily compare, but I always think about it when I'm standing in the aisle at the store, and and there's 1,000 whiskeys for people to choose from, and I always got to ask what they like, and if somebody's gone that softer profile or that weeded bourbon, or they're in that real maker's kind of approachability, that's where we are. Our overall approachability and softness on the palate, that is an absolute shining aspect of our bourbon. It is 42%, so not terribly high on the ABV, but it is incredibly easy to drink. And from the get-go, we've got a few things working on our side. The very first being our mash bill. So even though it's a little bit younger whiskey, because it's not all corn distillate, it's not going to have such that hot nose and that kind of intimidating heat that a lot of higher corn younger whiskey kind of has. So because it's got so much malted barley, it already comes across softer on the nose. And for me, on the palate, go ahead.
Does that malted barley almost, like the some of those weeded bourbons that seem to almost smooth out quite a bit on the palate? Is that malted barley kind of work the same way on the nose?
Exactly. So really in whiskey, there's Corn and rye are your little more assertive or aggressive grains on the palate. And wheat and, well, when distilled correctly, wheat and malted barley tend to be a little softer, a little easier to drink on the palate. And so that's why I say this, typically with a wheated bourbon, you'll find that same similar consumer is agreeing with our bourbon. But the flavor off the get-go is another attribute of ours that is really sets us apart and really kind of helps let the consumer understand what that recipe means, because it's a little more textural on the palate. There's a tiny bit of sweetness up front, but really it's not a ton of sweetness. Like, it kind of dissipates pretty quickly. And it moves into this, wonderful granular texture. But it's got more of a light, for me, it's very apple forward. Bushels of apples, stewed apple, apple pie and apple crumble and all that kind of stuff. And the rye is just enough to let you know it's there. It's got a little bit of a spice. It's kind of that cinnamon that's in the middle of your mouth, that's kind of letting you know that it's there. And maybe even that tiny bit of raisin that you might get from there. That's that rye kind of talking. But really it's about finding that balance of our mash, but pot distilled, low corn, high malt barley distillate, and at level 3 char. When 2 years was not enough, even I know it's silly to say, but 2.5 and 3 is really where that sweet spot starts to find our whiskey. And then of course, as it gets older and older, it just gets better and better. But easy on the palate is a grand theme of our whiskey.
I think it's funny because I do like some of the higher proofs. Now I don't go full proof monster, like we got to have the 130 proof in order to enjoy it, because that's whatever. But you get like some of them that are hovering around that 80, and I use Basil Hayden's as an example, where I think it's such a high rye, and it's almost like they're trying to add spice to take away from the 80 proof. That's what it feels like to me. It's like a caramel, and then you get hit with that rye to like almost feel like it's bumped up from 80 proof.
Right. You're now getting a grain spice as opposed to a heat spice kind of an idea.
Yeah, but it almost feels like not artificial. It just feels like it's forced to, like, we're trying to proof this up from 80. This has a lot of flavor to it, to me. And it doesn't just have that like to me, Basil Hayden's. I always go back to Basil Hayden's because it always feels like that's where people go to at that 80 proof, where it's just a very caramely juice that gets hit with a spice. Like, this seems way more complex than like an 80 proof. Obviously it's at 84, but it definitely adds more than just a low proof that is try to be like artificially spiced up with rye.
And that's what happens when you're able to use barley not just as a conversion grain, but as a flavor grain. Again, corn, great oils. I love basil. Adam Harris, if you somehow hear this, I'll talk good things about Basil Hayden. Adam,
I didn't mean that bad.
But it's a wonderful mouth oil, but you're right, there's not a ton of that flavor on there. There is, it's a beautiful whiskey, but where ours is more complex on the flavor molecule from the grain structure versus the flavor from the oak on an otherwise lighter canvas of corn.
I think it's really interesting how you made that point of the malted barley being used as a flavor and not as, whatever, like a binder or a
So in the distilling world in olden days, anyways, you had to have malted barley because the enzymes in the malted barley are what convert the rye and the corn into usable fermentable sugars for the yeast to eat. So it's an absolutely necessary part of the whiskey making process, which is why beer, as we know it, is made from 100% malted barley, and the original whiskeys are made from 100% malted barley. But when you come to the United States and you look at where we are on a map, malted barley just doesn't grow great in the United States as a whole. Corn is our grain. We're several degrees lower in latitude than Northern Europe. So we still had to have that malted barley because the structure of corn and rye need those enzymes to break down.
Really interesting. It makes perfect. It really is. It I think that's where people are starting to get more into whiskey in general, is like learning more about it. And it's not just, okay, we're going to go, rip shots of Jack Daniels at a bar, when we're 21, and you
one of the avenues of success that we see for the future of our company is in education, and
sure,
not just educating the consumer about our product, but educating about whiskey and what whiskey is and how important whiskey is and whiskey's history in the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you come into the distillery and you take one of the tours, it's, of course we're brand forward, but we really want to make sure that all of our guests are understanding that we care about the whiskey making process. And first and foremost, we're all whiskey fans. We all loved somebody else's whiskey long before any of us were involved with this business and making Boulder Spirits.
Sure. I mean, that makes perfect sense. You didn't start out liking your own brand. I mean,
yeah,
but
there's very few legacy distilleries, and one day that's what we're all hoping for. I can guarantee you Al would be more than proud to, pass it off to one of his boys, as years go by.
Yeah, I think, I got to make a couple of trips to Ireland and do a couple of the distilleries out there, and I haven't done Colorado or like the Bourbon Trail in Kentucky or anything like that. But I know when you get out there and you start to hear people talk about it in a passionate way, where they care about, like you said, it's obviously brand first because you're trying to promote your brand, but having education about just whiskey in general is incredible. I mean, I know myself and a couple of people I know did like the Stave and Thief program, and it's not the end all be all, I'm sure. However, like just being able to educate yourself and learn that there is more about it that's really interesting. I think that's what gets people interested in digging in a little bit more and like hearing that there's a lot more about it than just, like I said, ripping shots of Jack or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's a generational thing as well. A lot of the younger generation really want to experiment, and they almost want to have less, but spend their money on higher quality. Yeah. We've seen that with the beer industry, 12, 13% of the market now. The spirits industry is about, I think, volume wise, it's only about 2.5%, but it's increasing every year. People are becoming a little bit pickier about what they taste. They want educated about what they're buying, and they're prepared to, rather than 3 Jack Daniels, they'll have 2 Boulder bourbons. So it's happening. It's slow. We're at the forefront, certainly, of the single malt whiskey. There isn't many of us here that are doing a American single malt whiskey. So yeah, and I'm with Ryan. We work hard at the education side, informing people, transparency in what we do, how we do it. And I think that bears from what I said right earlier. It's very difficult to assess what you're getting from American whiskey because they never really say what their mash bill is. So you don't know what flavors you're going to get. So you stick to what you know rather than try and experiment and move around. Colorado's great. We used to have, before COVID, we used to have events all the time. There'd be 40, 50 distilleries there. And for $50, you'd get in and you'd be able to taste until you weren't allowed to taste anymore. And you were able to go around and taste everybody's whiskey or gin. And those events are crucial.
Yeah, and we're talking 40 and 50 distilleries from Colorado. Colorado leads the nation still in distilleries per capita. So our spirits trail is number 2 only to Kentucky's. We are very progressive. We got a lot of craft beer. We've got, I think, 70 some wineries, and we've got 100 registered licenses to distill, which equals about 70 or so operating distilleries. And so we're, our Colorado, lifestyle really yields to finding new things and finding unbeaten paths, and all of us really collectively as a state of distillers, we're all kind of after that. Most of us are after that new path and to make your own way and that kind of stuff. And I think that's kind of what sets our state kind of apart from a lot of the other themes of other states.
Sure. There's there's a big state. I'm not going to name states, but there's a big state that is making a lot of whiskey right now, and I haven't got into them yet. And I'm not. There's nothing against them necessarily. I just haven't found something from there that I've really enjoyed. But what's funny is I've had a couple of conversations with some distilleries out of Colorado, and everybody speaks of it the exact same way. They're all very supportive of one another, and the idea of making good whiskey that everybody in the state can be proud of, that their focus on making quality whiskey is very authentic. I think that's really cool about what you guys have going on in Colorado, and also for you guys as a whole, as a brand, because I think if you were to take somebody who, whether they're a new bourbon drinker or experienced, and you gave them something that is a higher malted barley content, I think they're going to be able to find the nuances between the two. And I think that is part of what makes like whiskey drinking a lot of fun.
Yeah, and we do a lot of on our tours and in any of our tastings, we love to do that sort of comparing and contrasting. So, what's the difference between this mash bill with a bourbon versus a single malt whiskey versus a finished versus a bottled and bond. So we take through tastings pretty seriously, and as much as that, compare and contrast. So we always finish with the peated at the end because that stays in the palate for a bit longer. Sure. We're very into that comparing and contrasting different styles.
Yeah, I can imagine the peated going first might have a impact on the rest of the tasting experience.
Yeah, it's.
Yes.
I mean,
we may do a.
We've done enough R&D at these events that every now and again I would just sneak it out because people they get excited after so many tastes of alcohol, and sure. I can tell them how to taste in whatever suggested order there is, but every time there's going to be somebody that says, nope, I want to have that one first. Oh. And they do. And then they try to have anything else after it. And I just shake my head. I told you.
Yeah.
I told you.
That's why I'm here to help you, but don't worry about listening. Alistair, you mentioned the distillery. Where are you guys at in terms of, protocols right now? Are you opened up for tours or anything right now?
Well, we shut down for our cocktail menu about a year ago, just when COVID hit. And even though we're allowed to open up 50%, we've made the decision. We are doing a lot of tours, and the tours are very personal. They're single group tours. We're not adding, two families or two groups. And we, for an hour and a half, and we really go back to this education about the whiskies, the comparing and contrasting, what the grains, the flavors of the grains give you. So we're doing a lot of those at the moment. I've got 3 tomorrow, for example. So we're seeing that is actually, it's a lot easier, but we get more time with the consumer. We got more time to speak to people rather than people coming in just for which is great, like an old fashioned or whatever. And I don't know whether we will open the tasting room per se again, because I think we're having a great, we're doing well with not having it open and having these private tours and really making it a bit more of an education center. And we're liking that.
And, Tony, like that touches exactly what you were saying, that, this next wave of bourbon enthusiasts and whiskey enthusiasts are much more of that. We want to get past that 101, and we want to peel back the label and learn a little bit about it. And so I think, and as crazy as it sounds, this is a great transition time for us to really find our way and being that space for Boulder and Boulder County and the Front Range of the metro area of Denver area. I really can't reiterate enough like how important it is for when we have people in our facility to really use that time to educate. And maybe it's not about whiskey, and we utilize our facility for events to host local nonprofits or something like that, or we utilize our facility to do staff trainings for bartenders about selecting single barrels, or we do anything that, so long as it involves our space and utilizing it for not just not only the communal bit, but really for a touch of education, because that's we all have these at the Power. We're all Google machines now. We're all Wikipedia, and so like it's hard to like kind of fight through fluff, or to try to just pitch fluff and not have people fight back through it. So why bother doing it? And really embrace where we're at, and especially like we said earlier, the younger consumer is absolutely engaged in that kind of stuff, and they want to care where their dollars go a little bit more. So we got to give them something to care about.
I think that's such a great perspective on it, because you're right. Like, people are interested in the details of it, the history, the intricacies. Like, they want to know about the spirit and where it came from and how it was made. And I think there's more questions about, the process than just like pour it and drink it and like it and okay, I like it or I don't, and move on. Like, I think there is a piece of it that people do want to know more about it. And so I think it's a great plan to really focus on the education, because you're right. People are getting more into it, and they ask questions like that. And it's not just, do I like this or do I not like it? They're really getting more into it. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah. And this last year, we've all had nothing but more forced time upon us.
Yeah.
Some people just worked twice as much, and some people had to find a hobby. And for a lot of people, that hobby became whiskey, and that hobby didn't just become tasting whiskey, became tasting every whiskey and trying to find out everything, every whiskey. And it's really neat to see. It's really cool being somebody that's been in the industry, for 10 or 12 years now, and to see what it's blossomed into, and to see, how many people are into whiskey. It's really cool.
I don't want to take up your entire day, because you guys have been incredibly gracious, but I do want to ask, what is your distribution like? Where, in terms of, where are you guys being sold currently? And also, is there a way for people, if they are in an area where you're not openly available with your distribution, that they could order Boulder Spirits from?
Oh, that's all Alistair on that one. That's his department.
That's a great question. I mean, we're distributed in 15 different states, and that's growing. As distributors take us on, we're growing. The difficulty, or the developing thing within the whole industry, is this direct-to-consumer. I believe Arizona are allowed direct-to-consumers out of distilleries. Now, a lot of the other states are not allowed that. So it goes through the three-tier system, the distributor, the retailer. This is all opening up. And, we are in discussions with some other states online. So all our products will be available online, but it will not be fulfilled by ourselves. It will be fulfilled by a third party. And it's not about logistics. It's about legalities. So consumers in Arizona will hopefully soon be able to buy our products online, and it's fulfilled by a third party. So always going to have the issue with shipping, but that's being developed as well. And that's not just us, it's everybody. So yes, we're in 15 states. Yes, I've spoken to Arizona distributors. So we need to get to that point where we're distributed in Arizona.
I agree.
We're in California. We're in hopefully Florida within the next few weeks, Oklahoma, the Northeast we're hoping to be in very shortly, Nebraska, New Mexico. So we're growing, but like a lot of distilleries, you got to grow depending on what supply you have. So we're being cautious in that way.
Yeah, it seems like
all of your Canadian fans, we just shipped some stuff to Canada as well.
Nice. It's funny because
I'm just looking at 2 pallets of products going to Canada because Canada is all monopoly, all control, and there's a lot of whiskey enthusiasts that have got together, formed a distribution company, and just saying, with hell with it, we're going to bring our own stuff up. So they're bringing, 2 pallets of our product up, and then as a whiskey group, they're going to start selling it through their own distribution arm.
Wow.
So they've taken the bull by the horn. They're all full-time in other jobs, but they've formed a distribution company to distribute our whiskey.
It's pretty smart, I think, though. But now, okay, so if I were to want to get the peated one in Arizona, if I knew a guy, can you order directly from the website or a third party to get that here?
No, the website will already go to another party. Like there's that's already an affiliate kind of deal. That's not. It's okay. That is the biggest bane of our existence right now.
I bet.
Because almost everywhere in the world can you get direct consumer alcohol, and because we still live in the shadows of post-prohibition 3-tier system laws, we're all at state by state whims, and certain states can ship to others, and it's not reciprocated, and it's a mess.
It's like there's 50 different laws going on between states. It's crazy.
Yeah. Very much so.
It will change. COVID is forcing this, forcing change. Kentucky recently did pass direct to consumer.
The House bill,
Hawaii passed direct to consumer.
Oh.
We are petitioning for the same. So it will happen, but there's a lot of people. There are special interest groups that see themselves losing out financially. So we're fighting against that. And to be honest, even if we can, we're such a small, craft distilleries is such a small part of that supply chain, is that I think it would actually benefit the distributors if we can promote our products across the country, as the wine guys can and the beer.
Yeah, you think if the wine guys can, you can too. And that's what I think. I mean, if they ask me, I'm going to give them that piece of my mind. So, it's so funny. Yeah. It's funny because everybody I've talked to, when you ask, like, hey, where are you guys at? And everybody says Colorado. Everybody seems to go to Colorado. And I don't know if it's just because tourism, people are, going to Denver or going to ski areas or what, but it seems like Colorado is a very popular place for distilleries outside of even like not close to here. And, in our area, they really want to get into Colorado.
A lot of distilleries, a lot of small brands, what we even say are follow the national distribution model. And if you're one of the big guys and you put millions of dollars behind a product and you're going to launch in the United States, your test markets are going to be LA, Chicago, New York. And that's just how it goes. And so what a lot of people don't know is that fourth market is actually Denver. Wow. And we get so much attention on our market because we are a very, very, very thirsty state. And we spend our dollars on, the premium and super premium level of spirits that we always have been this kind of fourth or fifth market that people open up, and even for experimental releases and things like that from bigger brands. And so as you actually see these smaller brands grow and start to hire sales managers and marketing directors from these bigger companies that are trying to build their own businesses and therefore take over, and help smaller brands kind of with their distribution model, you'll find that New York and California and Illinois and Colorado subsequently are always kind of those top 4, 5 to 10 markets.
Wow. That makes sense. I
get
it.
Industry inside kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Where are you guys at on social media? Where can people find you?
No Twitter, so Facebook. We're Instagram heavy.
Okay.
Very Instagram heavy, but at Boulder Spirits is all of our stuff. I'm sure we'll start a TikTok here, in 5 years. Again, we're a team of very, very, very few operating all of this kind of stuff. So social media is incredibly important, but we're kind of sticking with the Facebook and Instagram marketplaces.
Nice. Makes sense. Well, guys, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate the insight. This has been extremely helpful and educational, man. This is really cool. I could probably sit here and nerd out with you both all day long, and because I have so many questions about the process and the whole just industry as a whole. So I really appreciate the time.
Well, come
Absolutely.
and visit when you get a chance.
I will. I definitely will. If I get up to Colorado in the near future, I am coming by there.
The invitation is there.
Great.
Awesome. I appreciate it. You guys take care of yourselves. Thanks so much for your time again. I appreciate it.
Cheers.
Right, guys. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Tony.